Death entered Carmine's restaurante so quietly that evening that no one noticed it. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected off crystal glasses. Wealthy patrons laughed over expensive wine. Classical music drifted through the dining room. Everything looked elegant, controlled, and perfectly ordinary. But hidden among the polished tables and whispered conversations was a secret that would change the city before midnight. And the first person to see that secret was not a police officer, not a bodyguard, not a gangster. It was a waitress, a woman most people never truly looked at. They noticed her size. They noticed her uniform. They noticed how much space she occupied. But they never noticed her. Her name was Rosa DeLuca. For 6 years, Rosa had worked the crowded floor of Carmine's, one of Chicago's most exclusive mob-connected restaurants. Every night, she carried heavy trays through narrow aisles while wealthy diners treated her like part of the furniture. At nearly 300 pounds, Rosa had spent her entire life learning how to endure stares, jokes, and cruel comments. Her feet ached. Her back burned. Her uniform never fit quite right. But the worst pain was not physical. It was the feeling of being invisible. Customers spoke about her as if she could not hear them. Kitchen staff made her the punchline of their conversations. Some patrons looked at her with pity. Others looked at her with disgust. Rosa rarely reacted, because invisibility came with one unexpected advantage. People revealed dangerous things in front of someone they considered unimportant. Over the years, Rosa had overheard enough secrets to ruin careers. She knew which businessmen were laundering money. She knew which politicians were cheating on their spouses. She knew which suppliers were stealing from the restaurant. And she knew exactly who Marco Ferrara was. Marco was the heir to the Ferrara crime syndicate, a man feared by judges, politicians, and rival gangsters alike. Unlike the loud mobsters who threw money around to impress people, Marco was terrifyingly quiet. He always sat at table 7 with his back against the wall and a single glass of neat bourbon in front of him. That night, however, something felt different. The air inside the restaurant was heavy, charged. Wrong. Rosa carried a tray of osso buco toward table 7 and felt her pulse quicken. Marco was not alone. Across from him sat Danny Sorrento, a rival boss from the South Side, whose reputation for violence was legendary. Danny's eyes were sharp and restless. 3 bodyguards stood behind him. Marco had brought 2 of his own. The table looked less like a dinner and more like a battlefield. "You're making a mistake, Marco," Danny said in a low, harsh voice. "The harbor territory belongs to me. My father built it." Marco's expression never changed. "Your father built a legacy," he replied calmly. "You built a liability. Reckless men attract federal attention, and federal attention is bad for business." Rosa stepped beside the table. "You're osso buco, gentlemen," she said softly. Danny barely glanced at her. "Beat it, sweetheart. Men are talking." His hand brushed her side and immediately pulled away as if he had touched something unpleasant. "Can't this place hire waitresses who don't eat the entire kitchen inventory?" A familiar wave of humiliation climbed Rosa's neck. She lowered her eyes, just as she had done 1,000 times before. Then she saw it. Marco's phone lit up on the table. His gaze dropped to the screen for less than a second. In that tiny opening, Danny moved. Rosa caught the subtle flick of his thumb. A tiny glass vial appeared in his palm. A colorless powder slipped into Marco's bourbon and dissolved instantly into the amber liquid. Perfectly smooth. Almost impossible to notice. If Rosa had not been standing directly beside the table, she would have missed it. Marco looked back up, completely unaware. "We're done negotiating, Danny," he said. "I want the shipping manifests on my desk by midnight." Rosa froze. The sounds of the restaurant faded into a dull roar. Her mind raced. If she screamed, both sets of bodyguards would draw weapons. If she stayed silent, Marco Ferrara would drink poison and die in the middle of her section. The gang war that followed could tear Chicago apart, and she would probably be caught in the crossfire. She needed to act. Quietly, Rosa shifted her weight. Then she deliberately slammed her hip into the heavy oak table. Dishes rattled. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." She flailed dramatically and reached out as if trying to catch herself. In the same motion, her hand struck Danny's wine glass, sending red wine exploding across his lap. "You clumsy idiot," Danny shouted, jumping to his feet. His bodyguards instantly reached inside their jackets. I'm sorry, sir. Let me clean that. I'll bring fresh drinks right away, Rosa babbled, playing the panicked waitress. Without waiting for permission, she snatched Marco's bourbon and Danny's shattered wine glass onto her tray. Get away from me, Danny snapped. Marco raised a single hand. His men stopped moving. Then Marco looked at Rosa, not with anger, with curiosity. A man who noticed everything had just watched an accident that looked suspiciously intentional. Rosa turned and hurried toward the kitchen. Her heart pounded against her ribs. When she reached the industrial sink, she dumped the bourbon down the drain and ran hot water over it for several seconds. Only then did she realize the truth. She had just saved the most dangerous man in Chicago, and the real danger had only begun. The restaurant slowly returned to an uneasy silence. Broken glass had been swept away. Fresh drinks were served. Conversations resumed. But nothing felt normal anymore. Rosa carried another tray through the dining room while pretending everything was fine. Inside, her heart refused to slow down. Every second that passed made her wonder whether Marco had noticed what she had done. Or worse, whether Danny had. 10 minutes later, Danny excused himself and disappeared toward the restroom, still furious about his ruined suit. For the first time that evening, Marco was sitting alone. He hadn't touched his dinner. He hadn't ordered another drink. He simply waited. Rosa took a slow breath. She placed a fresh glass of bourbon onto her tray and walked toward table 7. Every step felt heavier than the last. She gently set the drink in front of him. Before she could pull her hand away, Marco's fingers wrapped around her wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it left no room for escape. "You didn't trip," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only certainty. Rosa forced a nervous smile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ferrara. I've always been clumsy." Marco studied her face without blinking. "No, you were watching my glass. Then you looked at Danny. And then you hit the table." He leaned forward slightly. "That wasn't an accident." For a brief moment, Rosa considered denying everything. Then she realized something. Lying to a man like Marco Ferrara was probably more dangerous than telling the truth. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marco's expression never changed. "Don't insult my intelligence." His voice remained calm. "I watched Danny poison my drink. I also watched you risk your own life to remove it." Silence settled between them. Rosa stopped pretending. The frightened waitress disappeared. For the first time that night, she stood exactly as she was. Confident, steady, unapologetic. "If I had screamed," she said quietly, "both sides would have opened fire." She glanced around the dining room. "My manager is standing behind that bar. The dishwasher has 3 children. There are families eating dinner 10 feet away. Innocent people would have died. So I chose the quieter option." Marco stared at her. His cold eyes searched every expression on her face. Most people spent their lives trying to impress him. Rosa wasn't trying to impress anyone. She had simply made a decision, one she believed was right. For the first time in years, Marco found himself genuinely surprised. At that exact moment, Danny returned. His expensive suit was still stained with dark red wine. His face burned with humiliation. "This conversation is over," Danny snapped. "You'll have my answer tomorrow." Marco nodded calmly. "Before you leave, join me for one drink." Danny laughed. "I don't drink your cheap bourbon." Marco smiled. "I insist." Rosa quietly placed a fresh glass in front of Danny. The poison was gone. The danger had passed. Or so she believed. Danny picked up the glass with a smug grin. "To your downfall, Ferrara." He swallowed every drop. 5 seconds passed. Nothing happened. Then Danny's body suddenly stiffened. His breathing stopped. His eyes widened with terror. He grabbed his throat. A horrible choking sound echoed through the restaurant. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor. Customers screamed. Chairs crashed backward. Danny collapsed onto the floor, his entire body shaking violently before becoming completely still. Dead silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Danny's bodyguards reached for their weapons. Marco's men reacted instantly. 3 warning shots exploded into the ceiling. The sound echoed through the restaurant like thunder. Everyone dropped to the floor. "Lock the doors," Marco ordered. His voice cut through the panic with terrifying authority. "No one leaves." Within seconds, armed men secured every exit. The elegant restaurant had transformed into a crime scene. Rosa stood frozen behind her serving tray. She looked at Danny's lifeless body, then back at Marco. Slowly, Marco walked toward her. Each step echoed across the silent dining room. He stopped only inches away. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a tiny empty glass vial. I found this under the table. He held it between two fingers. It fell out of Danny's hand when you bumped the table. Rosa recognized it immediately. Cyanide, she whispered. Marco watched her carefully. You recognized it very quickly. I've seen enough things in this restaurant to know what cyanide looks like. Marco gave the slightest nod. I thought so. He stepped even closer. The terrified customers, crying children, and frightened staff disappeared into the background. For a few seconds, it felt as though only the two of them existed. Then Marco asked the question that would change Rosa's life forever. If you knew I was a dangerous man, if you knew exactly who I was, why did you save me? Rosa looked at Danny's body lying on the floor. Then she looked around the restaurant. Many of the same people hiding under the tables had laughed at her only minutes earlier. Some had mocked her. Others had treated her like she wasn't even human. Finally, she looked directly into Marco's eyes. I didn't save you because you're a good man. I saved you because, unlike everyone else in this room, you've always treated me like I exist. You never looked at me with pity. You never laughed. You never acted like I was beneath you. She took a slow breath. You may be feared. You may even be a monster. But you're a monster who remembers to say thank you. A monster who tips fairly. A monster who treats a waitress with basic human respect. She paused. In my experience, that's rarer than people think. Marco didn't say a word. He simply stared at her. For the first time in many years, someone had spoken to him without fear, without greed, without asking for anything. And somehow, that someone was the woman the entire city had spent years pretending not to see. Marco didn't answer. Not immediately. The restaurant remained frozen in silence as paramedics and police sirens echoed somewhere in the distance. His eyes never left Rosa. For years, people had spoken to him with fear. Some spoke with greed. Others spoke because they wanted power. But this woman, she had spoken with complete honesty. Without asking for money. Without asking for protection. Without asking for anything. A slow smile appeared on Marco's face. It wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was the smile of a man who had just discovered something unexpectedly valuable. You don't belong here, he said quietly. Rosa frowned. I work here. No. Marco shook his head. You survive here. There's a difference. Before Rosa could respond, the restaurant doors burst open. Police officers flooded inside. Detectives followed close behind. The entire dining room erupted into controlled chaos. Marco leaned closer. Our conversation isn't over. Then he turned toward the officers with the calm confidence of a man who had spent his entire life walking through dangerous situations without ever losing control. Within minutes, lawyers arrived. Witnesses were questioned. Statements were taken. Nobody could prove exactly what had happened. Officially, Danny Sorrento had collapsed after drinking from his own glass. The investigation would continue, but there wasn't enough evidence to arrest anyone. By the time Rosa finished giving her statement, it was well after midnight. She stepped outside through the restaurant's back entrance. Chicago's winter air hit her like ice. Snow covered the empty alleyways. Everything was silent. She wrapped her thin coat tighter around herself and started walking toward the bus stop. Then she noticed them. Two black SUVs waited at the end of the alley. Their headlights remained off. One of the rear doors slowly opened. Marco stepped out. He wasn't surrounded by shouting bodyguards. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He simply stood there, watching her. I was beginning to think you'd leave without saying goodbye, Rosa said. Marco almost smiled. I wanted to see what kind of person walks home alone after surviving tonight. I can't exactly afford a limousine. No, you can't. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Snow continued falling around them. Finally, Marco broke the silence. Get in. Rosa looked at the SUV. Then back at him. I don't think that's a good idea. It's the safest place in Chicago tonight. She folded her arms. I'm not part of your world. Marco looked directly into her eyes. You became part of it the moment you saved my life. His words settled heavily between them. Rosa knew he was right. Danny's organization would eventually discover someone had interfered with the assassination attempt. If they started asking questions, the waitress who spilled the drinks would quickly become their first suspect. Marco seemed to read her thoughts. They'll come looking for you. I know. And if they find you first. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rosa understood perfectly. After several long seconds, she climbed into the SUV. The heavy door closed behind her with a deep metallic sound. Inside, everything was quiet. Soft leather seats, dark wood panels. A crystal decanter rested inside a built-in cabinet. The vehicle pulled away without a word. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The city lights drifted past the windows. Finally, Marco poured 2 glasses of scotch. He handed one to Rosa. She accepted it. Her hands trembled slightly. Marco noticed. You're scared. Rosa took a small sip before answering. I'm sitting beside the most dangerous man in Chicago. I think being nervous is a reasonable reaction. Marco gave a quiet nod. Fair enough. She looked at him. What happens now? Marco rested the glass in his hand. My organization has a problem. Rosa waited. Someone inside my operation has been feeding information to federal investigators. They've also been working with rival families. I've spent months trying to identify the leak. I've questioned everyone. I've trusted no one. And still, I've found nothing. Rosa listened carefully. I'm sorry, but what does that have to do with me? Marco's eyes narrowed slightly. Everything. She looked confused. You spent 6 years inside a restaurant where politicians, judges, businessmen, and criminals all believed you were invisible. You heard conversations nobody else noticed. You saw details trained security professionals completely missed. You caught Danny poisoning my drink. My own bodyguards didn't. He leaned forward. That isn't luck. That's observation. Rosa remained silent. Marco continued. People underestimate you. They ignore you. They dismiss you before you even speak. He paused. That makes you the most dangerous observer in any room. For the first time that night, Rosa understood why he had come back. He wasn't thanking her. He wasn't trying to repay a favor. He was recruiting her. I don't know anything about organized crime. You don't need to. I've never carried a gun. I don't need another soldier. I need someone who sees what everyone else misses. The SUV stopped in front of a massive iron gate. Security cameras followed the vehicle as the gates slowly opened. Beyond them stood an enormous estate covered in fresh snow. The mansion looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Rosa stared through the window. You live here? Marco looked ahead. I survive here. The same words he had used inside the restaurant. Only now, Rosa finally understood what they meant. Rosa barely slept that night. The guest suite she had been given was larger than her entire apartment. The mattress was softer than anything she had ever slept on. The room overlooked acres of snow-covered gardens. Everything around her was beautiful, yet none of it felt real. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had been serving dinner to strangers who barely acknowledged her existence. Now she was waking up inside the estate of Chicago's most feared crime boss. She stood in front of the bedroom mirror. For a long moment, she simply looked at herself. The same tired eyes, the same round face, the same woman the world had ignored for years. Only one thing had changed. Someone had finally recognized her value. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Ferrara is waiting for you. Rosa followed the housekeeper downstairs. The mansion was breathtaking. Every hallway was lined with priceless artwork. Security cameras watched every corner. Armed guards stood silently at every entrance. Despite the luxury, the estate felt less like a home and more like a fortress built for survival. Marco was already seated in the dining room. A simple breakfast rested in front of him. He looked up as Rosa entered. Good morning. She hesitated. I've never had breakfast with a crime boss before. Marco allowed himself the faintest smile. There's a first time for everything. For several minutes they ate in silence. Neither seemed uncomfortable. Finally, Marco placed his coffee cup on the table. I've arranged for someone to meet you this afternoon. Who? A tailor? Rosa looked confused. I don't need new clothes. Marco shook his head. Your appearance has been used against you your entire life. He leaned back in his chair. That ends today. A few hours later, one of New York's most respected designers arrived at the estate. She carried dozens of fabric samples and design sketches. After taking one look at Rosa, she smiled politely. I know exactly what will work. She pulled out several dark-colored designs. Black, navy, vertical lines. They'll create a slimmer appearance. Marco's expression immediately hardened. No. The designer looked surprised. I beg your pardon. I didn't ask you to hide her. Silence filled the room. Marco walked toward the display table and picked up a piece of deep emerald fabric. This, then another. Burgundy, then another. Royal blue. He looked directly at the designer. I don't want her dress to disappear. I want her dress to be remembered. The designer slowly nodded. I understand. Marco turned toward Rosa. You've spent your entire life trying to make yourself smaller because other people were uncomfortable. His voice remained calm. From this day forward, you take up exactly as much space as you deserve. For a moment, Rosa couldn't speak. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Not once. The fittings lasted several hours. Elegant dresses, tailored coats, custom shoes. Everything was designed specifically for her. Nothing was meant to hide her. Everything was meant to celebrate her confidence. When Rosa finally looked into the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. For the first time in years, she didn't see someone who needed to apologize for existing. She saw someone powerful, someone worthy, someone impossible to ignore. But not everyone inside the estate welcomed Marco's decision. One man, in particular, watched everything with growing resentment. Vincent Caruso, Marco's underboss, his closest advisor for nearly 20 years. Vincent believed loyalty had to be earned through blood, not handed to a civilian waitress. That evening, Rosa wandered through the mansion's library looking for a quiet place to think. She settled into a large leather chair hidden behind towering bookshelves. A few moments later, voices echoed from Marco's private office next door. She recognized Vincent immediately. This is a mistake. His voice was sharp. She's a civilian. She knows nothing about our business. The captains are talking. They think you've lost your judgment. Marco answered without raising his voice. Let them talk. Vincent wasn't finished. You're risking everything for a woman you met yesterday. No, Marco replied. I'm investing in someone everyone else failed to notice. Vincent laughed bitterly. She's just a waitress. The room fell completely silent. When Marco finally spoke, his voice had changed. It was colder, much colder. If you ever refer to Rosa that way again, I'll consider it disrespect toward me. Another long silence followed. Then Vincent answered quietly. Understood. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. The conversation was over. Rosa remained perfectly still behind the bookshelf. Her heart was racing. She hadn't meant to overhear the conversation. But one thing had become painfully clear. Vincent hated her, and hatred had a way of making intelligent people careless. As she walked back toward her room later that night, one thought refused to leave her mind. If someone inside Marco's organization was secretly betraying him, the first person she needed to watch was Vincent Caruso. 3 weeks later, Chicago's most prestigious charity gala brought together the city's wealthiest businessmen, powerful politicians, respected judges, and the criminal empire that quietly controlled them all. Everyone smiled. Everyone shook hands. Everyone pretended they were respectable. Rosa stepped out of the black SUV wearing a custom-made burgundy velvet gown that fit her perfectly. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to hide. Camera flashes lit up the entrance. People turned to look, not because they recognized her, because they couldn't ignore her. Marco offered his arm. You look extraordinary. Rosa smiled. I finally believed that. Together, they entered the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the enormous hall. Champagne flowed freely. An orchestra played softly in the background. Every smile concealed a secret. Every handshake hid an agenda. Marco quickly became the center of attention. Politicians surrounded him. Business leaders waited for their turn to speak. Meanwhile, Rosa quietly slipped away. Not because she felt uncomfortable, because this was her assignment. Observe, listen, disappear. She wandered toward a quiet balcony overlooking the city skyline. Several guests walked past without giving her a second glance. Exactly as she expected. Some habits never changed. People still underestimated her, and that made her dangerous. A few moments later, the balcony door opened. Vincent Caruso stepped outside. He wasn't alone. Alderman Thomas Crawford followed him. 2 men from the remnants of the Sorrento family joined them seconds later. Rosa remained hidden behind a marble column. None of them noticed her. Vincent spoke first. It happens tonight. His voice was calm, confident. When the gala ends, Marco takes the private elevator to the underground garage. The security cameras? Already disabled. The drivers? My men replaced them an hour ago. And Ferrara's bodyguards? They'll be dead before they know what's happening. Rosa felt her heartbeat accelerate. Every missing piece suddenly fit together. Danny's assassination attempt, the leaked information, the betrayals. It had all begun with Vincent. Marco had trusted him for 20 years. Vincent had been planning his murder the entire time. Without making a sound, Rosa slipped back into the ballroom. She found Marco speaking with several city commissioners. He noticed her immediately. She didn't speak. She simply met his eyes, then gave one slow nod. Their signal. Danger. Marco excused himself without hesitation. Moments later they met alone inside a quiet hallway. Vincent, Rosa whispered. He's working with Crawford. The attack happens in the underground garage. They replaced your drivers. Marco closed his eyes for one brief second. When they opened again, every trace of emotion had disappeared. Only absolute focus remained. My personal guard will take you somewhere safe. Rosa shook her head. I'm staying. No, I'm not leaving you. Marco looked at her for several long seconds. Finally, he nodded once. Stay behind me. They walked toward the private elevator. The doors opened. The underground garage was almost completely silent. Rows of luxury vehicles reflected the cold fluorescent lights overhead. Halfway across the garage, the first gunshot shattered the silence. Bullets slammed into the armored SUV. Marco instantly pushed Rosa behind a concrete pillar. His security team returned fire. The garage exploded into chaos. Smoke filled the air. Glass shattered. Engines roared. Vincent stepped from behind another vehicle. His pistol pointed directly at Marco. It should have ended weeks ago. Marco slowly faced him. You were family. Vincent laughed. No, I was patient. You handed everything to a waitress. You stopped trusting the people who built your empire. Marco's voice remained calm. No, I finally trusted the only person who never lied to me. Vincent pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. His pistol clicked. Empty. He looked down in disbelief, then heard Rosa's voice behind him. Looking for these? She held the magazine in her hand. While everyone had focused on Marco, she had quietly removed Vincent's spare ammunition from the nearby table where the weapons had been prepared. The distraction lasted less than 2 seconds. It was enough. Marco's men surrounded Vincent. Within moments, the gunfight was over. Crawford was arrested while trying to escape. The remaining conspirators surrendered. 20 years of betrayal ended in less than 5 minutes. Silence returned to the underground garage. Marco slowly walked toward Rosa. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, he smiled. Not the cold smile that frightened his enemies. A genuine one. You saved my life. Again. Rosa shrugged. I was just paying attention. Marco laughed quietly. Exactly. He looked around at the people gathering nearby. Politicians, business leaders, police officers, journalists. Every one of them watched in complete silence. Marco took Rosa's hand. Then, in front of everyone, he dropped to one knee. Gasps echoed through the garage. He looked directly into her eyes. Every powerful man in this city believed he was smarter than everyone else. They all made the same mistake. They looked right past you. He stood and gently lifted her hand. You are not my employee. You are not my assistant. You are my equal. The most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody notices. Then he kissed her. Not for attention, not for politics, not for power, but because, for the first time in years, he had found someone he could trust completely. Rosa had spent her entire life feeling invisible. That night, the entire city finally saw her, and none of them would ever underestimate her again. The world often overlooks ordinary people, but sometimes, the person everyone ignores is the one who changes everything.